Let everyone know that this presentation is brought to you in partnership with Becker. And as a member of Beta Gamma Sigma, you have access to exclusive discounts, including special packages for the CMA and CPA reviews. You can learn more about this by visiting our website. So thank you for joining us for the presentation on choosing the best certification for your career goals. This session will explore the CPA, CMA, CIA, and EA credentials and how each certification supports different career goals, industries, and roles. It's my pleasure to introduce Mike Brown. He's a senior national instructor with Becker Professional Education. Mike has vast experience in many industries, including manufacturing, financial, retail, real estate, and service. He has impacted hundreds of thousands of individual students in Becker's CPA and CMA review courses and so many more through his presentations at conferences, accounting firms, universities, and in the online community. So please join me in welcoming Mike.
Well, thank you, Matt, and good morning or good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. It's a great pleasure to be here. Um, I feel like today I'm taking a little bit of a trip down memory lane because before this, actually, I had a webinar where I was talking about Beta Alpha Psi, and I was a member of that in college. I was also a member of Beta Gamma Sigma. So at least it's helping me feel younger than I actually am, which is never a bad thing in my book. So yeah, thank you for spending some time with us today. I realize that pursuit of a credential or certification is one of those things that most students say, well, I get that it's useful. I hear people tell me it's going to help me, but perhaps you've asked questions around, well, which one is the right one? And is there a right one? Or is there a right two or three? And when should I pursue them? And how should I pursue them? And these are all excellent questions. And there's no easy one size fits all answer. One of the key things to take away from today's presentation is every one of these you need to view through the filter of what your goals are, kind of what your interests are, and why that would make sense. Ultimately, getting through any credentialing process, any certification requires drive and a desire. So you have to have a reason to be motivated. And so hopefully, I can at least give you some baseline information to kind of compare and contrast these different certifications for sure. But also, I hope to give you a little bit of a framework where you can think about how to weigh the pros and cons of various credential options. I will tell you that at least with the four that we're going to talk about explicitly today, they each will open more doors than you might think. I always am a believer that any credential that is recognized outside of the business community has value, and it's an intrinsic value. And every one of those credentials you see here on the title slide has that quality where there may be folks out there who may not know what the letters even stand for, but they know they mean something important. They convey skills, effort, and expertise. And let me tell you, it's never a bad thing on your resume to have letters behind your name because that's at the top. And it's kind of cool when a handful of letters can convey, in some cases, more information than the actual resume itself because folks understand the challenge and the effort required to obtain those certifications. Okay, so with that said, let me give you kind of a high level overview of what we're going to cover. I'd say we're pretty well knocked out on number one, the welcome and introduction, but now I'm going to dive into each of the credentials in specific. So I'm going to talk broadly, kind of what credentials in general do, and then we're going to walk through each of those. Um, Give you some of a framework in terms of, well, how to decide, what to think about, what are some pros and some cons, what folks sometimes ask me, and what I answer back when they ask about different certifications. We're going to share some links, and we're also going to make sure I'm going to be providing a copy of this presentation deck to Beta Gamma Sigma so they can share it because the last few slides of my deck include QR codes for different resources on Becker's website. Basically, for each of the credentials, we have a PDF downloadable guide that you can fill out a form to obtain, which will kind of give you more detailed information about that specific credential or credentials, as well as if you are kind of coming to that decision point and you want to see what exactly Becker's course is all about, you can take a 14-day demo of any of our platforms. I'm a big believer that as much as I'm biased, in fact, we were joking before we started that I don't have a virtual background and it's practically wallpapered here in my office because I do a lot for Becker. And so, yeah, I'm absolutely biased, but I'm a big believer that you should do your homework. This is an investment. It's an investment, whether it's financial or in some cases your employer may cover the cost. There's still an investment. Your time, your effort, your dedication. I don't believe anyone should make any kind of significant investment in their life without knowing what it is they're signing up for and make sure you understand what it is you're getting into. And so that's where, just like taking a test drive before you drive a car, to me, doing a demo of something like our courses, I think is essential to make sure you're well informed going into that decision making process. Toward the end, I'm also going to talk through some FAQs, some kind of common questions we're asked. But as Matt mentioned, we're going to be able to spend some time toward the end of our hour together to look at any questions you may have asked through the Q&A feature. By the way, it's good practice, if nothing else, because those Becker students who do what we call our live online, which is an option to have synchronous classroom experience, also uses Zoom, and we use that Q&A feature too. That's how we capture all of our student questions during class. So if nothing else, it's good practice for you. In any case, let's go ahead and start here. And I'm curious, and you can put this in the chat. You can, just sort of whether you want to just put the three letters in there, but is there one that is of greater curiosity to you right now? Did you come into this webinar saying, well, I definitely want to get my CMA, but I'm curious about the others? Or I've heard the most about the CIA, but people have said maybe I should think about my CPA. It's okay whether you say that or if you come in saying, I have no idea. I'm curious about any and all, and I'm sure there are more credentials than this, which is also true. There are a lot of credentials out there. Again, we're separating these out because of their broader appeal. I'll give you one quick piece of advice. A lot of folks over the years have asked me, well, what about credential XYZ? And it can be from a seemingly out of alphabet soup. One of the things I often encourage is when you start working, when you start kind of on that career journey, if you know someone, if you look at someone in your company in a particular role where you go, I would love to do what they do in a few years, then I'd say, well, what credentials did they get? And I'd ask them, why did you get that credential? Has it helped you in that part of your career journey? Do you think it's worthwhile? That may help you to further weigh the pros and cons, is ask people who have gone through this process ahead of you. But regardless of what you were curious about, we can certainly talk to it. And we're going to start by why is credentialing important? What's the value that it provides? Well, number one is in and of itself, the fact that you have to go through the process of earning it in each of those cases, passing a rigorous set of exams. It clearly is meant to prove your technical knowledge. It is designed to be a boost to your career path. But as I say, exactly which one's the best fit will be based upon, in part, where you'd like your career to go, how you'd prefer to specialize. If you're eligible, in some cases, you may already be eligible right now for one or more of these, but not all of them. That may change once you graduate. So there's different requirements. It's important to be able to understand what those various requirements are. But fundamentally, if we asked folks, why did you get your CPA, CMA, CIA beyond any legal reasons, right? For example, if you want to practice in public accounting, if you want to sign off as the partner on an audited financial statement opinion, then you have to be licensed as a CPA. But beyond that, more broadly, why do people pursue and earn credentials? First off, it's a differentiator. As I said, it's on your resume. It is there on the top line. It now, I like to say that it immediately elevates you from anyone who doesn't have it. So if there's Michael Brown and Michael Brown CPA, Michael Brown CPA has a higher chance of being hired simply because of those letters. Two, it's really hard, and I'm sure you've probably heard this, I'd imagine from your career services office, that resumes are important, but the trick is it's very difficult to get your resume to stand out in a pile. And so one of the things you try to do is how can I convey depth of skills in as quick a way as possible? And again, that's the value of having three little letters that bring with them oh, this is someone who has to be very methodical or very kind of organized because you can't prepare and pass the exam unless you are. And it shows their dedication and it shows their commitment. Again, it's all of these kind of wrapped up in three letters. You can say a lot about your skill set. Now, this is the third point here is one I always battle with because on the one hand, I go, I don't think it's about the money. I think that's a factor. I don't think it's the factor. I think there's so many other things that are relevant to what makes a successful and a satisfying career. But I also recognize that a number of you are probably accountants or at least are conversant in financial language. And so I can also understand the value of an objective measurement. Believe me, the CPA is one example, but it is broadly true of all of the credentials we're going to talk about. Will it boost your earnings potential? Yes. Put a different way, there's extrinsic proof that says, does someone who has it versus someone who doesn't get paid more over their career? And that's a definitive yes. It's not to me as much about what that number is, but it's more about it's a clear indication that the people who it needs to matter to, the employers say, yes, we see value. We're willing to pay a premium price to get it in our company. And that's part of the value. And once you're within that organization, it also provides credibility. It adds credibility to the organization you're a part of. I had a firsthand experience with this, kind of a peculiar one, in fact. One of my jobs early on in my career, I was working as an assistant controller it was a public company, but a relatively small, certainly not Fortune 500 size. But they still had to deal with financial reporting issues like any public company would. And they were in the midst of trying to hire an accounting manager's position. Now, as a stopgap, they had me kind of keeping things going while we were looking for that person. And honestly, I looked at the role, looked at the responsibilities. I said, I think someone with an associate's degree could probably do this. It's not quite bookkeeping, but it's not a whole lot more than that. And so that's kind of what I figured when I would see the job description, it would say. And it didn't. Instead, it said CPA preferred for that role. I actually asked the CFO, I said, why? It doesn't that doesn't seem necessary. And he said, no, but I just like having CPAs around. For him, it was the value that credential provided to the organization, and in particular, his part of the company, his department. This gets the idea that you can't know what doors any particular credential might open beyond those that you'd normally think it would. I'm living proof. I don't do accounting. I have not had to record a journal entry in a very long time, and I'm fine with that. But I would never have gotten my foot in the door at Becker now almost 20 years ago without my CPA. Now, if you told me coming out of school and then working in the profession for the first couple of years, Mike, you need to get your CPA so you can go work for an education company and teach, I would have gone, that doesn't make any sense. But that's exactly what happened. So it's curious to know there are doors that it's like they're going to give you a key and you're going to say, it doesn't look like it would fit that door. And yet it'll open it anyway. That's part of the value. And that's why as you meet people, as you network and you talk to folks and you hear their stories, you'll get a better idea of that. You'll say, huh, well, why did you're a CPA, but you're doing this? Yeah, not only is that helping me do that, it probably opened the door to help me do that. All right. So let's talk a little bit about each one. So we'll start with CPA. I would argue probably the best known of the bunch. I'll warn you now that those outside of the accounting universe know what CPA represents from a business standpoint. The bad news is once you get your CPA, if you like tax, you're going to be in great shape. If you're like me and don't like tax, just brace yourself because everybody that you ever meet and you mention you're a CPA will immediately assume you can help them with their taxes. I then have to warn them, no, you don't want that. I will probably do more harm than good. It's the same answer I give to Becker every so often. They ask, well, can't you teach regulation? Can't you teach tax? And I go, you don't want that. Bad for me, bad for Becker, bad for the students. And so, but what is a CPA? Well, as I say, it is unique among the four we're going to talk about because it is a license, not just a credential. What's the implication there? Well, it means that each state has to manage how that process works because it is a state-based license. Probably the closest analogy is the legal profession in that you have to get licensed in a particular state. The good news, at least, is the exam is not different. It's the same CPA exam everywhere around the world, but the process and the eligibility rules around becoming a CPA do vary from one state to the other. I often say, kind of my mantra is all the states are similar, but no two are identical in those rules. But it is the most commonplace when we think about credentialing in accounting because it covers such a broad base of subject matter. You're going to see that reflected in the content of the CPA exam in just a moment. But as I say, when you ask the question, well, what does a CPA do? It's more of a they can do anything. It isn't a being a CPA does not pigeonhole you into a particular career or a particular job. In fact, arguably the CPA enables greater flexibility. And as I noted with my example story, CPAs are desirable both within industries and even in places you might not ordinarily think. For example, boards of directors seek CPAs to be on the board. Why? Well, particularly for public companies, their audit committee needs to have a financial expert, or at least that's what they should have. So CPAs bring that skill set, and it tends to be a desirable one. So it can open all kinds of doors that you might not expect. When do folks usually begin the journey? Well, I would argue with most of these, there's an education requirement. So while you're in college, you are effectively working toward any number of those requirements. But in terms of kind of really going all in and working on it, most will sit for the exam either in grad school. That's about the earliest we see folks start is the summer after their undergraduate work is complete. If they don't go to grad school, it may be that summer into starting to work. One thing I will tell you about the CPA exam is it will be its most approachable immediately after graduation. It gets much more difficult the further away from school you are. Two reasons. One is it's an academically grounded exam, so you're moving further from academia. The other is the CPA is a broad exam. Once you enter your career, you don't tend to be broad, you tend to specialize. But college does its whole intent is to give you a broad base of knowledge and skills. Ultimately, what is the difference between someone who has those letters and not? I mentioned the one legal reason is you cannot sign off on assurance work. So you can't sign off on audited financial statements or reviewed financial statements. That would include if it was a company filing with the SEC, a CPA cannot do, or a non-CPA cannot do that. Beyond that, it's not a requirement, but again, it's beyond that a differentiator. Okay, so let's talk about the CPA exam a little bit. So the exam regularly shifts and changes more often in small ways. Now, why is that? Well, because accounting is not static. The rules of accounting change. As the FASB issues new financial accounting standards, or the GASB by the same token, as the Auditing Standards Board develops new audit standards, as the folks up in that big white building pass changes to the tax law, these impact those sections of the exam. One great example is that earlier this month, one of the things that Becker has to always be on top of is how things are changing from an exam perspective. And one of those was what I have found the shortest way to say it is the OB3. That's the one big beautiful bill. But that became testable on July 1. So that's the kind of incremental changes that are always happening. And then they periodically review the structure, format, and broader content of the exam every 6 to 7 years. So it's an evolutionary process. So 2024 was the last major change to the exam, and that's where they created this structure. They said, well, we're going to create 6 exams. We'll start with the 3 they refer to as core. Every candidate must take and pass the 3 core exams: auditing and attestation, financial accounting and reporting, regulation and taxation, or as you notice, they're often referred to but kind of a 3-letter shorthand: aud, far, reg. They're fairly balanced. Most candidates will say, yeah, the amount of invested study time is fairly consistent across the 3 exams. And in terms of what they cover, so financial accounting and reporting, that's the blue one in the middle, and probably more than any other single exam, that's what most candidates do start with. Don't have to, you can do them in any order, but we find that's the most common. It's a little vague. If you look at the pie chart down below, those aren't exactly the most descriptive titles. I'll take a nod from professors who, when the exam was updated to this format, said, you know what, the FAR exam is a whole lot like intermediate accounting, or perhaps put a different way, if you've gone through 2 semesters of intermediate, you've probably got 90% of the foundation or better of what's on the FAR exam. So that's a pretty good analogy in terms of what to think about it or how to think about it. Auditing and attestation does focus principally on auditing, although it does cover other assurance services. About 80% of that exam kind of deals with the process of the audit, from learning about the client all the way through the reporting. 20% focuses on ethics. In fact, if you'll notice, auditing has an ethics component, so does regulation. This actually makes a lot of sense because that's exactly how the AICPA looks at it. When they look at this credentialing issue and the ethics beyond it, they say, well, all CPAs, no matter what they do, are bound to certain ethical and professional responsibilities. We're going to test those more on regulation. If you're in public practice, like you're doing audits, there's additional ethical and professional responsibilities that then kick in. And so they said those elements we're going to test on the auditing exam. So regulation or so ethics is relevant in two different sections. And then regulation and taxation, it largely is tax, about two-thirds. The other third split between ethics and business law. Now, the unique twist they added in 2024 was what they called the discipline sections. So you don't have to take all three. You don't have to pass all three. You can pass just one. And it doesn't matter which one. In fact, it's not even a binding choice. If you choose one and take it and walk out of the testing center going, well, that wasn't the choice, you can change it. I'll warn you, data says roughly 9 out of 10 candidates, whatever they start with, whatever they initially choose, they don't change. So it's really important as you lay out your study plan to weigh the pros and cons of each discipline. And it really, one piece of advice I've been giving students about how to make this choice is ultimately it's not about which one is, quote, the easiest. That's a tricky question because I would counter if you said, well, which one's the easiest? I go, how do you want to, what determines if it's easy? Now, some folks would say, well, which one has the highest pass rate? Which one is passed by more candidates? That would be the one on the right, TCP, tax compliance and planning. Which one has the lowest pass rate? BAR, business analysis and reporting. In the middle is ISC. But I think that question's a little bit off target. It's not about which one is, quote, the easiest. It's more about which one will be the easiest for you. And I'm a great example. I told you, I don't like tax. My brain and tax have not, do not, and probably never will get along. So even though TCP has the highest pass rate, I would not choose that for me because that would be playing to my weakest area. Even though BAR has the lowest pass rate, it's actually the content I'm most comfortable with. In fact, it's the section I enjoy teaching the most for Becker. So that would be part of it in terms of that decision-making process. As you'll note, BAR or BAR focuses on kind of advanced financial accounting plus cost managerial and financial analysis, and then governmental accounting. ISC is largely focused on information systems, a bit of computer science, also what the AICPA calls trust services. And then finally, TCP is the easiest of the bunch to explain. It's tax, just tax, lots of tax. Split between about a third for individual tax, about half is on entity tax, and about a sixth is a deeper dive into property transactions. All right, so that's the CPA in a nutshell. Let's pivot to the CMA. Now, I would argue that the CMA is probably the next widest known. I would say the CMA, perhaps, if the CPA is the best known in the US, I would argue the CMA, although is well known in the US, it is probably even more well known overseas. It is, the CPA is a US CPA license, it is US focused. CMA is meant to be a global credential. And it's everything the accountant does internal to a business. So if you have someone who's providing or helping with or making decisions based on cost analysis, cost volume, profit analysis, decision analysis, forecasting, budgeting, you name it, that's what a managerial accountant is. And that's what the CMA, again, just like the CPA kind of sets apart that, financial accountant, the CMA sets apart that management accountant. And so here it's I like to say that the CMA, I love how it says it there in the second kind of column. The primary role is to leverage their expertise to help the business make good decisions. I would say the secondary role is they speak the language of accounting and business decision making, which is a really good skill set to have because it's the kind of thing CFOs and CEOs do. And so you will find folks who begin as CMAs that work through corporate accounting, but because they have that broader decision making skill set, they can move to the very top of organizations. And they can use those skills across a broad range of industries. To be fair, that's true of CPA as well, within public accounting, as public accounting firms often will span and deal with clients in a variety of industries. So, what does getting your CMA help you to do? Now, this is a credential. The CPA is a license, meaning there is a legal reason if you're doing certain work, you have to have it. The CMA is a credential. It is strictly a prove that I have this skill set behind me. One of those is it's meant to encapsulate the strategic focus. A CMA can say, I can go down in the weeds, I can look at the details, I can make sense of that, but then I can pull back from that tactical level to the strategic level, look at the big picture and say, here's the implication. If based on this data, we should do X, here's why. Here's what that should accomplish for us. As I noted, with this is the same skill or good foundation for leadership. So you often will find that CMAs don't stop at the highest accounting role. They can move into the CFO, the CEO, even COO, those kinds of roles, what we call kind of collectively the C-suite. And as I noted, the CMA is a well-respected global credential. And it's understandable because although businesses speak a lot of different languages, there is one language they all have in common: numbers, accounting. Right? That's a truth across the entire world. So the CMA is well regarded in that, and it is a true global credential. So how does the CMA exam differ? Well, the CPA exam, as I said, 6 parts. You have to take 3 core plus 1 discipline. The CMA exam is a little bit different. It only has 2 parts. So, yes, if you're wondering, do some people pursue the CMA first because it doesn't seem quite so bad? Yeah, I've certainly heard that. But to be fair, I would argue the IMA, that's the Institute of Management Accountants, they're the body behind the CMA, has actually kind of leaned into that a little bit. As I noted earlier, CPA candidates generally will begin studying and sitting for the CPA exam after they finish their undergraduate work at least. So the summer after a May graduation at the earliest. Some wait until they're in grad school or even beyond. The CMA, they actually encourage students to take it while they're in school, and you can. Some still wait or do it later in their career, but it is still an academic exam. Part one's got a little bit more content. That's why the study time's a little bit greater. But each part of the exam has 6 major ingredients. They're not too radically different in terms of weight, certainly not in part one. And you can see from this list, it covers everything from what they call external financial reporting decisions, which is basically financial accounting, to some of the more skill, kind of the typical skills you'd expect a management accountant to have, from planning and budgeting to cost management, but also things like understanding internal controls and the usefulness of technology, and particularly the growing need for skills in the data analytics space. Ultimately, that's the CMA exam. Now, the newest, well, to me anyway, and the newest to Becker anyway, is the CIA. But I will tell you that although it doesn't have as long a history as the CPA and CMA do, it has certainly not been handicapped by its younger age. The CIA has been growing by leaps and bounds as the value of internal audit has grown similarly. Internal audit has a role of increasing importance within large corporations, large organizations, made even more important thanks to Sarbanes-Oxley and the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board and the like, and the importance of the audit committee and the role that they play. But ultimately, the role that internal audit can have in driving good governance, effective risk management, and effective internal control has driven why this credential has gained so much importance. And take Becker as a little bit of the cue on that. This was a credential that we went in with both feet about, gosh, now, not even 5 years ago, but in part because we get to partner with the Institute of Internal Auditors that sponsors this credential. I like to say that the CIA is a curious hybrid because they are, the one letter in common is audit. They are auditors. They have much and have to leverage much the same skill set that a CPA does doing public accounting work, doing assurance work. But whereas a CPA is external, they're doing it from the outside looking in, the internal auditor is working from the inside. They work for the company. Interestingly, an external auditor is focused on assurance generally only. They're basically checking to make sure the financial reporting is fairly stated and so forth. Internal auditors are looking to add value to their organization. Now, they can do that through internal assurance, but they can also do advisory. So I like to say if you enjoy audit, but you also enjoy consulting and you kind of think being able to kind of troubleshoot and help fix problems and give advice is up your alley, this is kind of plays to both of those skill sets. Now, the CIA, similar to the other credentials, requires education, requires passing the exam, and then achieving amount of experience. In fact, that what we could generally call the three E's is a good way to think of all of these three credentials. It's a combination of education, exam, and experience. So, what will being a CIA do for you? Well, again, it's a credential that's recognized and valued, so it will increase your earnings potential. It will open doors. Certainly, it is a differentiator like any of the others. Within an internal audit group, it sets you apart from other members of that part of the organization. And depending on the industry, that even becomes more important. And I say that because I'll tell you that in the past year or so, two of the organizations that I've taught and gone through and taught the CIA review to were both in finance. They were banks. And so that was an area where internal audit is incredibly important, and the organization places a high level of value on obtaining the CIA. Part of that, again, is prestige, both personally to set you apart from your peers, but also organizationally because of the value that CIA provides. All right. What's on the CIA exam? Well, they staked out the middle ground. So they said, four parts, taking four for the CPA, that's a bit much. But we gotta do at least one more than CMA. So they decided three different parts. They reorganized the exam fundamentally a couple of years ago, and I like it from how to explain it is to say, all right, internal audit at the most macro, kind of biggest big picture is the profession. How does internal audit function as a profession? What is its role? That's part one. That's what they call internal audit fundamentals. The most micro scale is a single engagement, a single task or work that an internal audit team is performing. That's part two, which is largely plan for the objective and then accomplish the objective. In between them, kind of, well, it's more than one engagement, but it's not every company in the entire profession. It's the internal audit function. So this would be how does internal audit work at an organization for that one organization, but managing a variety of engagements. And you can see here it deals with some of the operational aspects. And so that's how they break up the content on the CIA exam. Now that does leave one more. Now this is where I have to disclaim a little bit because I kind of already tipped my hand that this Mike here, and there are two, by the way, there are two national instructors for Becker named Mike. Thankfully, the other one is the tax law guy, among other things. So I'm glad because I can say, more often than not, when folks say, Mike, I have a tax question, I go, wrong Mike, you got the wrong Mike. Which is why it's kind of funny that I'm not going to talk about the fourth credential of the bunch, which is a tax credential. So you may ask why, if you're looking to stump me with questions, this is the one to go after because I'm going to go, yeah, I'm not as familiar with this one. This is not a credential I have, nor do I expect I ever will. Thankfully, there are folks way smarter than me in the tax universe that help out students who want to pursue their EA. The EA is a bit unique. Not only is it a recognized credential like the others, it is who offers it and what that means. In the terms of who, it's our good buddies over at the Internal Revenue Service. I have a mixed feeling on the IRS, by the way. That's where my dad worked his whole career. And so I think that's why perhaps I'm now preconditioned not to like tax. I don't know. But the IRS, this is the highest credential they award, but it has more than just that value. If you want to represent a client in front of the Internal Revenue Service, say you have a client that's being audited or something along those lines, and you want to be legally allowed to represent that client in front of the IRS, although the CPA will do that, and a law degree or a law license will do that, the other is the EA. So the EA gives you that same capability. So if someone says, look, I really would love to work exclusively in tax, I really would love to work with clients and represent them before the IRS. If they don't want to worry about or really they don't see an interest in other areas of the accounting universe, This is particularly useful for those that want to start their own small tax practice. Again, the EA puts them on the same footing from a representation standpoint. And so it really can open a lot of those kinds of doors. It still opens a lot of paths of availability, and it does set you apart, just like any credential would. A lot of folks even will say, well, wait a minute, though, I've seen the commercials on TV. Isn't this credential a little less useful because it only is for part of the year? No. A good EA understands more than just the tax preparation. They also understand tax planning, a little bit of tax strategy, and the IRS is not limited in when they're going to call your client with a question. So it is a year round and it's a year round opportunity to leverage. Number one, why be an EA? I guess I could joke so I don't have to, but really it's because tax law is not getting easier. It's only getting more and more and more complicated. I don't foresee that changing, even though I think a lot of us would say, please, can't you? Nope. But that means there's going to be high and higher demand for services and knowledge and understanding of these complicated tax issues. The EA indicates you've got that. Again, do people pay a premium for that value and for that credential? They do. But as I said, EAs in particular, not only is there the earning potential within an organization, but the EA can be that springboard into being an entrepreneur, being your own boss. And so that's an opportunity there as well. And the EA exam also took the CIA's kind of playbook here and said we're going to go with three parts as well. You'll notice here it's a bit more who are you working for and what are you doing for them. So part one focuses in on representation and issues around individual tax and the details of individual tax. Part two focuses on the business side of the house. And then part three is really, well, we're going to allow you to represent your client before the IRS. We should probably tell you what that means, what that does, how that works, what the rules are. And so it's a lot of the process, procedure, and practice around representation of clients for tax matters. All right. So there at warp speed, I've now given you an overview of the four principal credentials that Becker currently provides review materials for. But I'll reiterate, this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are a lot of credentials out there. Most still framed by that same 3E. So if you're ever curious about, well, what do I have to do to gain a credential? Usually a good place to start is that 3E. Say, well, what are the educational requirements? What are the exam? What's the exam look for? What is it going to test? And then what work experience must I have in order to gain that credential? Beyond that, doing your homework and talking to folks is a good way to help round that out and see if other credentials are worthwhile. Not to mention the fact that several of these organizations have sponsored additional credentialing opportunities. For example, the CMA developed a secondary credential called the CSCA, which is for strategy and competitive analysis. So there are always, if credentialing is something that you enjoy pursuing or helps you build as sort of a way to upskill, yeah, there's a lot of opportunities out there beyond just the four we're focusing on today. Okay, so I mentioned that I would tackle some of the most common questions that we're asked when we're kind of helping folks weigh the pros and cons of different credentials. And so we'll start with this one. Do we recommend getting more than one? Okay, with the full disclosure that that's good for us as a business, honestly, yeah. Will it, if one will help open doors, isn't it logical that two will open more? And here's the thing. A lot of folks in accounting do begin in public accounting. I did. A lot of folks do. And so it makes a lot of sense if you say, well, I'm starting there. I don't know if that's my whole career, but perhaps. And so a lot of them do go after their CPA. And then they say, well, I've enjoyed this. I've learned a ton. That's great. I don't see my long-term future in public accounting. I'd like to work in industry, whether in management, whether it's in internal audit, whether it's you say, I really love tax and I'd love to, and they'll pursue that alternate credential. And so, yeah, for those reasons, it can be organic, where you may find as your career progresses, you say, wow, you know what? I think I've reached a point where having this additional credential will be complementary. There are other strategic advantages, and I'll mention one in particular. It's a linkage between the CPA and the CIA exam. Now, I mentioned the CIA exam is a three-part exam, but there's a bypass to that. It's what's referred to as the CIA challenge exam. So if you already have your CPA, you don't have to take all three parts. You take a single kind of combined exam, but just one. The idea here is saying, well, if you're a CPA, you've already proven you have a pretty good depth of audit knowledge. You had to pass their auditing and attestation exam. So all we're going to test you on here is the stuff that's specific to internal audit that they would not have tested you on. So it provides a synergy. A lot of folks also ask me, well, if I prepare for the CPA exam, would that help me if I want to take my CMA or vice versa? Yeah, absolutely, in as much as there is content found on both exams. Obviously, on the CPA, there's financial accounting. It's a whole section. But external financial reporting draws on that same accounting knowledge, and that's a chunk of the part one of the CMA exam. So, yes, sometimes there is synergy in that as well. Now, if you said, I do think I would like to get two, or I see in kind of my long term career goals, which one goes first? Should I do them at the same time? I wouldn't. It is a commitment to study and prepare for a single, focus on one at a time. But can you do them in succession? Yes. As I say, some you are allowed to, and in fact, you may benefit from doing in school. The CMA is a great example. The EA also allows you to do it while you're in school. So if you've just completed 2 semesters of federal tax, you may find that you already have a huge leg up in preparing and sitting for the EA exam. Also, there are, we'll call them, I almost call them light versions of credentials in some cases, but one of the things that the CIA wanted to do is they said, well, we don't expect someone who is still in school or even just recently graduated to be well prepared for all three parts of the CI exam. But we do recognize that a student should be able to pass part one. That's the one that's about the profession as a whole, the kind of the job of internal audit. And they now award a recognized credential if you at least do that. So if you complete part one of the exam, you then can call yourself an internal audit practitioner. Now, that doesn't at all stop you from continuing on to do parts two and three and get your full blown CIA, but it does give you some additional options in terms of timeline. I will warn you that in terms of educational requirements, the CPA is the most robust of the bunch. And in particular, depending on the state, with that warning I gave you earlier, the states can vary in terms of requirements, in terms of exactly I guess to say exactly what you have to have on your transcript, that's where you see more variation and sometimes more specificity in terms of what courses. Some states will even say you have to have so many credits in this particular course or a particular level of the course. So bear that in mind as well. But ultimately, there is overlap. So studying for one can help you on others. Or in my case, I took the CMA and the CIA later in my career, grant, but part of it was I was teaching CPA review. That absolutely helped me with the relevant areas. Not to mention, I got a lot of practice in tackling exam multiple choice questions, which translated pretty well into both of those exams. In fact, all 4 exams include or are exclusively multiple choice. All right. So then you might be saying, well, okay, Mike, which one's the easiest? Yeah. Well, as I say, it's kind of like that discipline choice. It isn't really a question of which one is, quote, the easiest. Perhaps it's more relevant to say which one would be the easiest for you. And I would add to that, the more motivated you are, I believe that makes it easier as well. Or if you're less motivated, that makes it harder. So for me, it's more about what would you want to pursue first is probably the one that becomes in part easier. It's fair to say, though, in terms of parts, CMA's only got two, so that's a good argument why. And there are folks I've talked to over the years who said, I took that first because I figured maybe the CPA was a little too daunting. This seemed like a good stepping stone. That's fair. CIA, EA each have three. Of course, CPA has the four. Um, and the exams are different in their focus. The CPA, I would argue, is the most broad, right? It covers accounting, auditing, tax, and a whole range of other issues depending on the discipline. On the other end of that spectrum, you've got the EA exam, which is exclusively one thing. It's just tax stem to stern. So that too, it depends. Do you want to be more of a broad generalist? Are you looking for a broad range of skills and knowledge? Or are you looking for more of a bit more of a laser focus on specific elements? Now, I think it's always a trick for me to tell you, well, here's what you should do with your career. Um, Here's what I believe. Number one, you're not supposed to know yet. If you have a good idea what you'd like to do first, that's awesome. If you felt like, well, enough people that I talked to say, for example, when I was in school, when I was sitting where you are, a lot of folks said, well, Mike, whether or not you intend to do public accounting, there's no substitute for the kind of experience and how much experience and how fast you'll gain experience working in public accounting. And I went, okay. So to me, that made logical sense. But after a couple of years, I started to be able to more articulate answers to these questions. So let me go back in time with me to 3 years in at my firm, and I said, "Well, do I enjoy the work?" And I said, "Well, there are parts of it I enjoy, but not all of it." I started to be able to differentiate. I liked working with clients. I liked working with my industry. I did like certain industries more than others. I liked certain facets of the audit work, but not all of them. I started to get a sense of, well, did I like working in the public sector? Right? A lot of folks, one of the cool things you can do, even within public accounting, is I have folks that say, well, I want to work in the not for profit. I would love to work for a charity. Well, there are accounting firms and audit firms who serve that industry exclusively, or it's probably their biggest area. So that's a way to kind of combine a love for a particular area or a particular industry or a particular type of company with a type of work. But here's the thing, it's okay not to know day one, and it's okay to change your mind. Part of the experience of a career is learning along that path what you love. And I've often told candidates and students and folks over the years, I said, look, I know it's easy for us to say, if you make a change in career, if you change jobs, it was either a good idea or a bad idea. And I don't think that's fair. I think it's more about the more you know about what you enjoy, where your strengths lie, where your passions lie, if you can incrementally move closer to them, it was a good decision. And maybe you can make that in one giant leap and find your happy home. Maybe it takes a few changes. It did for me. I had 4 different jobs in the first 7 years of my career. And then I moved and got married, which, by the way, I don't recommend moving, marrying, and changing your career path within 3 months. I'll say that is straight up not the best advice. But then I ran into Becker, and it will be 20 years in January, which I can't believe either. Even as I say it, no, it's true. And you'll start to figure out what kind of work you enjoy. Is it more of the quote traditional accounting work, audit work, financial accounting and reporting? Is it tax? Or is it more diverse? Is it compliance? Is it strategy? Is it tactics? Is it decision making? Is it, helping big companies or individuals? The sky's the limit and the road is broad. The tricky part is to figure out which road you ultimately would love to end up on. All right. Now the next slide is meant to make your eyes hurt. I'm sorry. So a lot of folks would say, well, you gave us the high level overview of each of those exams, but I want to know exactly what's in each of them or give me some more specifics. Well, if you didn't ask for that, then I'm apologizing. If you did, well, here's the slide. I'm not going to delve into great detail here, but one thing I do want to point out that's another interesting difference between the exams is how they're given, but more when they're given. Today, all 4 are computer-based exams. You go to a testing center. CPA and CMA is done through Prometric. CIA is done through Pearson VUE, and EA, they just changed. I don't even know the name of the new company they're using. But CIA is offered year round. CPA is offered year round except for the disciplines, but the CMA and the EA is in discrete windows. It's just one more variable to think about when you're laying out a calendar and a study plan is to make sure the one thing you want to do is when you finish studying and you're ready to sit, you actually can go and sit. It's within a valid window. All right. We're coming to the end. I've kept an eye. I don't see any specific questions, but one more chance to ask them for sure. Oh, good. Here come a couple. But I'm going to put up these slides briefly. I'll leave them up as I answer a couple of questions in case you want to get your phone out because these are where the QR codes are. But we're also going to make sure that we circulate this deck after today's presentation. So the first is maybe as Hannah. Hi, Hannah, by the way, because I see she was one who just sent a question. If you know going in, there is one that is of greater interest, or you came in saying, yeah, I was curious about, but I really knew that if there was one I was going after, it's that one. We have developed kind of a PDF guide for each one, which will go in a little bit more depth than I did today on those. So you may find that to be a really useful resource. And don't worry, these are all easy to find on our website. In fact, if you just Google CPA exam guide, CMA exam guide, Becker should get you to where you need to go, but this will be your fast track. Um, as I mentioned, the second element is taking a trial. If you would like to take a demo, like I said, it's well, how does a Becker review program work? What's in it? What do you use? How do I use it? Again, I don't think there's a substitute for being able to demo it for yourself. And then finally, as was mentioned at the outset, we have what's called a preferred partnership agreement. Now, one of the good things is, and it's not meant to be a knock on what Beta Gamma Sigma is offering at all. My hope is that wherever your career may take you, you work for a company that understands the value of professional development and credentialing, and they may pay for Becker outright. This is when folks joke with me and say, well, how much does Becker cost? I go, well, hopefully nothing, at least depending on the company you work for. But if it's something you are interested in starting on before you've got a full-time offer, or you say, you know what, my company, maybe they don't offer that kind of opportunity, you at least have the advantage as a Beta Gamma Sigma member of what we call our preferred provider discount. You can go through the link here, do it electronically. You can certainly call Becker customer service if you're interested in ordering a course or learning more about it. But let's see some of the questions. So I'm just going to kind of take a look at a couple of these. I see some have come through chat and some have um, come through the Q&A. So I'll tackle the Q&A one first. So I'm not gonna say who asked the question, but I will at least read it. I'm interested in both finance and accounting career paths, but I think I'm leaning into finance. Awesome. Would you recommend any of these certifications to pair with finance over the others? Well, I will tell you that probably the depending on what flavor of finance. So if you have a desire to work in investment banking, kind of that Wall Street side of the financial universe, or anything in kind of financial analyst roles, there's no question the CFA is the predominant credential in that area. Years ago, Becker did the CFA. It's just what it turned out is that a lot of folks prepare for the CFA fairly differently than a lot of our current review courses, and it just was not a great strategic fit for Becker. But that's not a knock on the CFA's value. Um, I do find, for what it's worth, that I have met a lot of CFAs that were CPAs first, not just because maybe they started in public accounting and then transitioned their career into a finance focused role, or they had always dreamed of landing a job in finance, but basically they do complement each other because the CPA says, I speak accounting. I understand accounting. I understand financial statements. I speak that language fluently. And you put CFA with it, you go, and I know how to analyze it in depth. And I can tell you a whole lot of information behind what's going on with those numbers. So I would say that's an answer to that question. There are other finance credentials. One of our sister companies actually does the CFP. So if you have an interest in financial planning or personal financial planning, that's an opportunity as well. So there are definitely those, and believe you me, I'll tell you this as well. The lines between business majors have gotten grayer and blurrier, right? Find me an accountant who doesn't need to at least have a reasonable skill set in data analytics, or frankly, data analytics plus you name it. Um, a lot of folks do combine or blend majors or major minors or even their career journey because it just doesn't neatly fit into one category. I not only think that's okay, I think that's a good thing. I think it's a desire, if it's born of a desire to learn and upskill, that's never a bad thing. Another question was, do all the credentials mentioned require continuing education? I have to be honest, I'm not as sure about the EA and how their kind of re-up works, but I can say for the three I've got, yes, yes, yes. The good news is generally a lot of courses will count for all three at the same time. So if you are having to do continuing education for one credential, then you're likely taking care of two or three at the same time. But yeah, it's interesting how CPE has evolved. I actually hope, for what it's worth, we've historically seen CPE be you have to do so many hours per year or every 2 years or every 3 years. I think we may not be that far away from the day where it will become more competency based. So it's less about how many hours you get, more about continuing to develop your skills and build your technical know-how and get up to date on the most relevant new information about a subject that you work in and develop those competencies. But yes, that is an important part. Do you become overqualified with multiple credentials? I, yeah, again, you're probably going to say, well, I kind of know what you have to say, Mike, working for Becker. I genuinely, I don't think so. Now, one thing that I was taught a number of years ago that I'll share with you is, and it was an interesting idea because it had never occurred to me. This was when I was working, kind of had my quote full-time job with Becker, where I was doing at that time faculty management and some other things. And I was teaching both for Becker, but also doing some adjunct work. I was teaching at a local university. And so I said, well, I don't necessarily lean on the same exact skills or experience or education or credentials for each of those. And someone said, you can have two different versions of your resume, right? I went, what? They said, yeah, you can have one resume that emphasizes your business, quote unquote, your business skills if you're looking for the kind of a role in that. Or you could have a different resume that elevates or really focuses on your educational experience and skills for that. And I went, oh. So if you are worried about having the laundry list of letters after your name, it doesn't mean you have to use them at all times. I've got a couple of other credentials that over the years I've now kind of decided, you know what, I'm still proud of them, but at some point, does it dilute the message? Yeah, I think it may. And so I said, you know what? The three that took the most effort and are the most meaningful for me and most meaningful in my role with Becker are the CPA, the CMA, and the CIA. So those are the letters and those are the things that I focus on. And obviously, in my case, it's not a question of overqualified. I like teaching them all. And I figured if I want to convince Becker they should let me teach them, I probably should have those credentials. So that's part of it. So it could, but I think you have some level of control about the messaging behind the what credential you have and why you have it. Um, I'm looking through the chat. It looks like, and thank you. Got an answer that says yes, EA does have CPE. I thought so. One of the things that's tricky about EA is it does change sometimes unexpectedly, right? As I mentioned, out of really was completely out of the blue that the IRS decided to change the provider of the exam in terms of where you go to sit, what physical location you go to sit to. And it actually messed a little bit with the timeline of the exam for this year and when it was offered. So that's why I'm always a little bit more wary. Plus, as I said, that's the credential I don't have. So I don't want to speak and say, well, I'm sure it does. And then someone said, no, it doesn't. So, but yeah, and I do believe that continuing education is one of those things that is always valuable, even with no credential. I think it's always useful. Heck, do some people, I imagine, use CPE resources at their company as part of their, if they're saying, you know what, it's been a while since I took a course in that. I need to get up to speed and I would like to use that as a springboard to getting a credential. Yeah, absolutely that as well. So, well, folks, I've got two pieces of news. You can decide whether they're good or bad. Number one, there's no more questions. Number two, we're out of time. So I want to finish by saying thank you very much for your time, your attention. For those of you who did ask questions, appreciate that. Want to thank Beta Gamma Sigma for the opportunity to speak with you today. So thank you very much, Matt and team. Matt, anything you wanted to say as we close out?
Um, no, I just wanted to thank you, Mike, for joining us and sharing all your wonderful knowledge and wisdom with us, and everybody here today for joining us. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, take care. We're going to be ending the stream now, but thank you once again.